Today, we'll just talk about the research methodology in behavior economics, and we'll actually focus on experimental method. Another word for experimental method is randomized evaluation, and we'll discuss why it is a very powerful tool for understanding human behavior. As you can see later, that most of the results, the principles, the theories were derived from experiments from economics or psychology so far we have discussed, right? So that is a very powerful tool for us to understand human behavior. So here is the outline for today's lecture. We will talk about different methods in behavior, different research method in behavior economics. It's not only experimental method. We could use theory, we could use simulation to understand human behavior, right? But we will focus on experimental method, right? So that is in other words, randomized evaluation. And we'll talk about some properties of randomized evaluation, like how do we randomize and how the way we randomize would influence the validity of the result you get from the experiment. And we'll talk about some evaluation-driven effects that may make your result biased and how to eliminate this evaluation-driven effect. And then we'll talk about how to choose the appropriate sample size. As it turns out, I know that we are not a class in statistics, but the hypothesis testing is a very important component of the data analysis when we collect the data from the experiment. And one important feature that we should pay attention to when we design an experiment is that we need to have a large enough sample size in order to derive some valid results from the data. Otherwise, if you have a too small sample size, then the results are not reliable. And we'll discuss why it's not reliable and how do we choose the sample size. Last but not least, we'll talk about some ethical considerations when we run human subject experiment, right? So if you're a physicist, chemist, when you run an experiment, you don't need to consider this ethical consideration. But when we, as a researcher in behavior economics run experiment, it's mainly human subject experiment, and we need to get concerned about the potential influence towards the participant or subjects of our experiment, right? We want to make sure that the experiment will not influence harm towards their life. So that's the ethical considerations. So now the research method in behavior economics. I mean, first we could have theories, right? So we have a lot of theoretical models in understanding human decision making. We have like a decisions theory. Under decisions theory, most of you should have at least learned something about expected utility theory, right? So the expected utility theory just assumes that people are rational and they will try to maximize their expected utility. So that's theoretical analysis, and that is the research based on theory. I use the theory to make predictions to help us understand the corresponding behavior of human beings. And prospect theory, which is an important topic that we'll cover in 2 weeks by Suman. That's another type of theory. Game theory is something that most of you have already learned from Raphael's class, right? So use game theory to understand the strategic interaction when you have your outcome can be dependent on other people's actions. And we could use evolutionary theory to understand human behavior. We have implicitly used that a lot, right? Try to understand the decision process of our brain, try to understand the two system of thinking. All of these could be explained by evolutionary theory, and because this corresponding process functions in our brain would help us to survive in the ancient environment that our brain was wired. And in comparison to the theoretical studies, the theoretical analysis, we could have empirical study, right? Empirical study is just another word of studies that involves data, try to understand the data from the actual human behavior, right? Under the umbrella of empirical studies, we could have observational data. So sometimes this observational data can be called natural experiment or quasi experiment. We call it natural experiment or quasi experiment because they are not actually experiment. For an actual experiment, the experimenter, the researcher, need to randomly assign this participant into different groups. And then some group goes through this treatment. Some group will serve as a control, and then we compare the outcome of the two groups. So that's experiment, the experimental data. Observational data is something that you collect data from the field. It's naturally occurring, right? And because the observational data are naturally occurring, we don't have randomization there, and we have to use sophisticated econometric analysis to recover causality. So the data is there already, but the analysis is complicated, right? I think you have already taken the econometrics class, and it's basic. And later, when you get to the master level, you will learn a lot of these more advanced econometric techniques in order to recover the causal relationship from this observational data. Well, experimental data is that the data collected from experiment, right, or from randomized evaluation. So basically, you use randomized process to collect the data. So after the data is collected, the analysis is straightforward because this randomization would give you a good comparison of the treatment effect, right? So we'll discuss in detail. So experimental data can be collected from lab experiment. So lab experiments, basically you invite mostly university students like you guys come to a computer lab and to make a series of decisions. So, and of course, the participant might go through some of different treatment. Like, so you have participated in one experiment already, and you realize that all of you are randomized into different treatment in some of the tasks, right? So that can be considered as lab experiment. You know that you are participating in an experiment, and you make decisions through this series of tasks, and data is collected in the process. Well, field experiment is an experiment run in the field, meaning that in naturally occurring setting. Sometimes the participants do not even know they are participating in an experiment. Right? Sometimes they know, but most of the time they don't know. And then data is collected from this natural occurring environment. So in this sense, the field experiment is more contextual. It gives more context, right? So your decision is not abstract decision making as in the lab experiment. So that is experimental data. And we could also use simulation to understand behavioral economics. So we could use agent-based models. So we just consider there are a large number of agents and represented by some computer programs, and we set a certain rule for their decisions and see what are the potential outcomes, right? And if the outcomes are consistent with what we observe in our life, then the assumption made, the decision rule that is assigned to the agents can be considered as valid, right? So that's another methodology in conducting studies in behavioral economics. So what we'll focus in this lecture and throughout this course is how to use experimental data to understand human behavior, or how to run experiment to collect data so that it could inform our understanding of human behavior in behavioral economics. So behavioral economists mainly use experiments to understand behavior and test theories, right? And what we'll have for the rest of today's class is to have a brief introduction to experimental economics, right? It will help us to understand the literatures in behavioral economics, because if you read some of the papers in the field, as I have listed some of the corresponding references in the previous lecture notes, you'll see that they run experiment, right? So going through today's lecture will help you to understand how and why they design this experiment in this certain way. So talking about experimental economics, so it is closely related to behavioral economics, right? So behavioral economics start to gain popularity after this experimental method was adopted in the mainstream economics study. So here is a quote by Milton Friedman. So Milton Friedman is an economist, a famous economist in Chicago School, and he is a strong proponent and supporter of this rational choice theory. And he claimed that in economics, it's not possible to run experiment. So here is the original code. Unfortunately, we can seldom test particular predictions in the social sciences by experiments explicitly designed to eliminate what are judged to be the most important disturbing influences. Generally, we must rely on evidence cast up by the experiments that happen to occur. So he was mentioning that we are not able as economists to run experiment. Right? What we could do is just to collect data from the field. Sometimes there are some policy change that help you to more or less have this random assignment. But this code was like more than almost 100 years ago, 80 years ago, right? Uh, After this code, there was a fast development in the field of experimental economics. So here is the list of all the economists who use experimental method in their research. So we see there are researchers in psychology, in decision theory, in behavior finance, and also in development economics. So it turns out that it's not true that economists cannot run experiment, and it's actually quite important and quite informative for economists to run experiment to understand economic policies and also human behavior. So I did not list all the names for the Nobel laureates in economics, but if you are interested, you can check. But here is just a list of the large number of economists, the Nobel laureates in economics who has used experimental method to understand economic policy and human behavior. So here are some advantages of experimental method. So the two main advantages include the control. So in experiment, we can control institutions, the rule of the game, and the incentives, how much the participant would get rewarded if they make various different kinds of decisions. And we are able to measure some of the confounding variables that are not available to you if you get the data from the field. Right? For example, social norms, beliefs. These are things that are very difficult to get from the field data. And also this randomization. And that's the key for the success of experimental method. It could avoid self-selection problem, right? We will discuss what we mean by self-selection problem and why randomization is important, is the core of experimental method. And also experimental method is good for replication, right? When you run the experiment, you get certain result, and the materials that you run this experiment will be made publicly available to other researchers. So the other researchers, they can use the material to see whether they can replicate your study, replicate your result from another setting. Right? So this will help you or help the science community to check for robustness and false positives. Right? So false positive meaning that there are no effect, but because of the poorly designed experiment or this statistical analysis, you get the effect, you believe the effect is there due to your hypothesis testing, but the true effect is zero. And also, we have the norms in experimental economics to make your data available, make the instructions to the subjects that they receive available and the procedure available so that other people are able to replicate your study. So I remember my PhD advisor actually once told that there's a rule for experimental economists in preparing the experimental material, in that if you get hit by a car tomorrow, other people getting your material, they are able to replicate, to run your experiment and replicate your experiment. So that's the idea. So you need to make, I mean, the norm is to make the data, instruction, procedure available so that other people can replicate your study and also check whether your experiments are soundly designed and whether the results are convincing. And so these norms will provide an incentive for the researchers to do it right, because other people will check on you whether you are able, whether you get this nicely designed experiment and get the data and correctly and the analysis correctly. And so here I mentioned the norm is to make the data and the instruction and procedure available. So this has become quite important recently because, as we'll discuss later, there is a replication crisis, especially in behavior science and psychology. A lot of the result that has been discovered before, when you run the experiment again, I mean, the results are not there. So we will discuss why is that the case, but that also makes it more important for us to stick to the norm to make the data, the instruction procedure available. Now, let's talk about some jargons in experimental economics. So I might have already used the word subjects, right? So when we talk about subjects, they are referring to the participant of an experiment, right? So they are often called subjects, right? So when we say human subject experiment, which is all the experiment in economics and in psychology, is actually referring to the experiment that use human beings as participants, as subjects, right? And treatment variable, when we talk about in the experiment, it refers to the variable of interest that are randomly assigned by the experimenter, right? For example, we had this experiment on anchoring effect, right? So I randomly assign half of the class to the low anchor, the other half to the high anchor. So this anchor can be considered as a variable, right? So it's called the treatment variable, one treatment variable here. And depending on the value of the treatment variable, the result might be different. So, and once we get the result, it can demonstrate the effect of anchoring, right? And to test treatment effect, we need a control group for comparison, right? So the control group, sometimes also called comparison group or baseline group, right? So in the anchoring effect, so we can consider this low anchor as a control group, or you can say that these two treatment can both considered as treatment, right? So sometimes this control group could be just another group going through different treatment. You don't have to have this control group, but the general rule is that you need to have more than one treatment. You have the one treatment or the other treatment, or you have one treatment or control group that does not go through any treatment, so that you are able to compare what would happen if the participant, the subjects, go through a different treatment or do not go through any treatment, right? So that's some of the jargons in experimental economics. Now let's have a discussion of the three different types of experiment. So we talk about lab experiment. You have already participated in one of the lab experiment in class. So this participant would make a decision in a setting abstracted from reality, right? So you make decisions, you make judgment, but these tasks sometimes are abstract, right? Even though you are asked to imagine in a setting, but it's an imagined setting. In comparison, field experiment is where the participant actually participate in the experiment in their natural environment, their everyday life or work environment. So the participants sometimes are not even aware of the experiment. They're not aware that they are participating in experiment. They make decisions in a natural field setting, right? So another name for field experiment is randomized controlled trials. If you hear the term randomized controlled trials, RCT, that refers to field experiment, right? So when the participant make decisions in this natural field setting, in the natural environment that they make decisions. And the last type of experiment is actually not an experiment. We call it natural experiment, but no one actually run the experiment. No researchers design the experiment or run the experiment. So here, natural experiment just refers to this naturally occurring data that caused by some policy change. And it is like that some of the participants, they are randomly assigned to different treatment, right? So data emerged by chance from real world events and behavior. So it's not designed by the researcher, right? So here are some examples. This US draft lottery in 1996, that was long before all of you were born. So it was during the Vietnam War. It was before I was born. So Vietnam War. So it's actually complete a lottery system to decide which person among the young men would just get drafted to serve in the military in Vietnam to fight this Vietnam War, right, in the United States. And it's quite fascinating if you look at some of the TV documentaries. So it's actually the government would make the TV show, live TV show, and also on the video, it just announced the date of the birth that decide whether a young man would be drafted to serve in the military, right? So it just randomly picks the date of the birth throughout this year. All the young men who were born in that specific date, they are required to serve in the military, right? So these dates were randomly chosen, and it can be considered as randomly assign those young men towards this drafting, right? So that can be considered as a natural experiment. And also this Oregon State Medicaid program lottery in 2008. So Medicaid is just the healthcare towards these these poor people. And in the state of Oregon, one state in the United States, they actually use the lottery system to decide who is qualified for the program. And that's a quite interesting natural experiment in the sense that it can be considered as a random assignment for the different participants to decide whether they are qualified. Right? And then after this policy change, we are able to investigate the effect of getting enrolled in the Medicaid experiment, Medicaid program. So we will not talk a lot about the natural experiment. That's what econometricians and people in labor economists or economic historian, they mainly use natural experiment. Right? So in behavioral economics, we mainly use this lab or field experiment. The actual experiment, the researcher use randomized evaluation, using randomization. So now let's just have a brief comparison of lab versus field experiment. Behavior in the experiment may be influenced by subjects' perception of what the experimenter want or expect. So that is the so-called experimenter demand effect. So if you're participating in an experiment and you are expecting that me as the experimenter may want you to behave in a certain way, and that expectation may change your behavior, right? So that's not something we want. Field experiment, to some extent, could avoid experimenter demand effect if subjects are not aware of the experiment. If you are able to make the subjects in field experiment not aware that they are participating in an experiment, you are able to minimize or even eliminate the experimenter demand effect, right? But so that's the advantage of field experiment. It may be possible for you to prevent the participant, the subject, from knowing that they are participating in an experiment. So then this experimental demand effect could be eliminated. However, in field experiment, the experimenter, the researcher, has less control over the incentives they receive, the measurement of behavior. Because in the lab experiment, you make decisions, and I record your decision through the computer program, right? So your decision is indicated. I can collect all kinds of variables from you. But in the field experiment, because it's naturally occurring, it's quite difficult to collect most of the all of the important informations, right? So sometimes if you collect the information, then the participant may know that they are being involved in an experiment. And also this ability to replicate under identical conditions are also quite difficult, because in the field experiment, you are studying the human behavior in a specific setting. And if you go to a different setting, usually they are quite different. And this ability to replicate under identical condition is difficult, because it's difficult for you to find another identical condition to replicate the experiment. So that's the comparison and the pros and cons of using lab versus field experiment. So in terms of design, you could have between subjects versus within subject design. So between subject design refers to different people experience different treatment. While within subject design, it's the same people experience different treatment. Let me give you an example. If you still remember this Alan and Ben, this experiment, this halo effect experiment, right? So it's just, we have 6 additives describing the property, the features of 2 people. So that is within subject design, because all of you go through the same task. You rate the friendliness, the level of friendliness or likability of Alan, and then you rate the likability of Ben, right? So that's within subject design. Between subject design is that in this experiment, half of you is assigned to one treatment, the other half is assigned to the other treatment. So that's between subject design. So you could use either between or within, depending on the setting. And as you can tell from the first experiment, I used both between and within subject design, depending on the needs. So there are, again, pros and cons for these two different types of design. For between subject design, the advantage is there's no contamination between treatment. But the cons, the disadvantage, this randomization need to cancel out idiosyncrasy, right? So you need to make sure that these two group of people, or the two groups, they are more or less comparable to each other, so that you know the treatment effect, the effect you measures are purely caused by the different treatment that they go through, right? So for within subject design, this randomization is not needed because you are the same, you are making two decisions. You know that's from the same person. So these idiosyncrasies are eliminated because you are comparing the decision made by the same group of people, right? So that's the advantage of within subject design. But the disadvantage of within subject design is the outer effect, because you first make a decision, and that decision might have an influence for later decision making, right? So if you have rated Allen, this level of friendliness, that may influence your perception of Ben, right? So this outer effect is difficult to eliminate, and sometimes it's not to work for some treatment variations. The advantage of within subject design is controls for individual characteristics, as I mentioned, because you are observing the two decisions made by the same person. So it's from the same person, it's the same group, and you're comparing the same group of people. So these idiosyncrasies, this specific characteristics of these two groups are completely eliminated. And another advantage is that you are able to get more observations for the same number of participants, right? So think about between subject design, we have, for example, 38 students. And if we use a between subject design, I'm able to collect data for 19 decisions for each treatment. But if you use within subject design, each of the 38 students will be able to make the two decisions. So I literally doubled the number of observations. So these are the pros and cons of between and versus within subject design. So that's the design issue that you can consider when you try to design your experiment. And one thing that we have to talk about when we study experiment in economics is incentives. Because for economists, incentives are quite important because economists believe that people respond to incentives. So because of this belief, it is a norm in experimental economics that decisions should be incentive compatible using monetary rewards. Meaning that if you look at almost all the experiments conducted by economists in the field of experimental economics, the experiment would provide incentives, meaning that your earnings for this experiment will be dependent on the quality of decision you make, right? So that is the so-called incentive compatible, right? So it is not the case in psychology, right? So in psychology experiment, usually the participant come and participate in this experiment, they will just receive a flat fee, right? So 20 euros or 200 Danish kroners, and their decisions will not influence the payment they receive. But in an experiment in economics, usually, most of the time, your payment, your earnings will be dependent on the decision you make, right? And in most of the economics journals, it's a requirement that the experiment should provide incentives, right? Psychologists does not require these incentives, and one important belief about the psychologists is they believe that participants, they come to the lab, they have this intrinsic motivation to help with science, with research, right? So they are already motivated to make decisions, make high quality decisions, and they don't think extrinsic motivations like the external monetary rewards is necessary, right? But there are some research that studies the effect of incentives, whether providing incentives is important. And here, this paper published in Journal of Management Accounting Research actually show that there is little effect in problem-solving tasks. If you are asked to solve math problem or this Raven's progressive matrix task that you participated, or the cognitive reflection task, these are considered as problem-solving tasks. Providing or not providing incentives does not matter that much. And we observe that it has this high positive effect in tasks where effort improves performance. And it has weak positive effect in judgment tasks, right? Meaning that if you have a judgment task, like the Linda problem, the Bill problem that we mentioned when we talk about representative heuristics, these incentives would improve slightly, very little, very slightly your quality of judgment. But for effort, for tasks where effort would improve performance, for example, you have a complex decision making that involves other people. In this case, providing incentives matters. And also for a wide range of tasks like risky gambles, decisions under risk, market tradings, bargaining, increasing incentives or providing or not providing incentives could reduce the variance of the result. But the treatment effect, the average behavior, whether you provide or not provide, or provide low or high, the treatment effect is there. It does not change by the incentives. What is changed maybe is the noise level. If you do not provide incentives, maybe people would make careless decisions, so the variance of the data will be higher. Right? But if you pay, then the variance will be lower, meaning that people would pay more attention when they make decisions. But the treatment, in fact, is not changed, whether you pay the incentives or not. Right? So now the question coming to us, because most of you are economists, you may want to ask, can we use survey data in economic studies? Well, many studies we have already seen that they are based on hypothetical questions, right? So the famous study by Kahneman and Tversky is published in famous economic journal. It's used prospect theory. It's one of the most cited economic papers. It's used hypothetical questions, and the participants are not paid based on their decisions. And also this paper in 1986 and published in economic journals is studied the fairness motivation, and is based on telephone surveys. So no incentive provided. So that shows that at least in recent decades, economic journals are open to data collected from the survey. Right? And also, if we think about economic research, especially the macroeconomic research, right? Like the income level, their household information, all those information were actually collected by surveys. Right? And if we just disallow the usage of survey data, then the macroeconomic research, we cannot continue. And also, we do not have any ground to reject survey data. So the key point we should keep in mind is it is important to use all sources of data, surveys, experiment, field evidence, to build a more complete picture of human behavior, right? So these data are not contradicting with each other. They should be considered as complements, right? So to see whether the result you observe from one data source is robust when we change the data from another source. Now, the issue of subject pool. When we talk about lab experiment, as I mentioned, almost all the lab experiment, they use university students. And is it a problem, do you think, to draw conclusions of human behavior just based on university students as subject pool? Think about it. Well, there are justifications for just using the college student. First, it's straightforward, right? So the researchers are at the university. It's easier for them to get a student to get to participate in the experiment, and it's usually cheaper to recruit students population to participate in the experiment compared to the professionals. And also another theoretical consideration why it is not a big problem to use college students as subject pool is that economic theories or theories of decisions, they does not specify the subject pool on which it applies. So that means, I mean, if you're testing theory, then if it should apply to the general population, then it also should apply for college students, right? And also, when you have homogeneous subjects as college student, rather than some random person from the society, these college students, they are more homogeneous. They are more uniform in terms of their characteristics, their background. So this homogeneous subject will have this higher than average education and intelligent may be even an advantage, right? So to check whether the corresponding economic theory would hold. But what we should keep in mind is whether the results that you get from the student population could be generalized to other populations. So generalization of result to other subject can be studied later. So here I notice a typo. It's not studies, but studied later. So when we observe the experiment that tests the behavior from different subject pool, it has been observed that students are observed to be less pro-social. And so they are less willing to help compared to a random person you get from outside of the university. And also, if there are experiments conducted among the CEOs are demonstrated to be more trusting than the students. Right? And also, students who self-select themselves into experiment, they are motivated by monetary rewards or interest in experimental tasks, lab tasks. Right? So this may be a specific group of students that we are testing. Right? So the experiments are valid. I mean, the experiment you're conducted are from this specific group of students. I mean, if we are interested in human behavior, they are humans, right? So that help us to understand human behavior, that inform us and provide insights into human behavior. But what is important is to consider whether the result you get from the specific group of student will be generalizable to other population, right? So that leads us to our discussion of external validity. So external validity is just the extent to which the result that you get from your experiment can be generalized to other contexts. So we talk about whether the results are specific to this subject pool or whether in the lab experiment you are making decision in abstract setting, whether this could generalize to other settings, right? So in this sense, if we compare lab experiment are context-dependent abstraction, right? So use participant to make decision in abstract setting. In comparison, field experiment are more real, but more context-dependent. So these have their own advantage as we talk about this lab versus field experiment. Lab experiment, because they are more abstract, it may be easier to generalize to another abstract setting, but field experiment, because they are context specific, it may be more difficult to find another setting that would exactly replicate the data. And the last thing that I want to talk about related to the research methodology in behavior economics is the recent new field called neuroeconomics. So neuroeconomics is just the application of neuroscience tools and method to economic research. Neuroeconomics is analyze brain activities using advanced imagery and biochemical tests before, during, and after economic choices. A neuroeconomics experiment provide measures of brain activity or psychological responses and provide insight to decision-making process. So throughout this course, we'll also talk about some of the results from neuroscience, from neuroeconomics. So here are some measurements that you could measure informed by neuroscience. You could measure people's brain activity when they make decisions. You could have this brain imaging. The most popular one is this functional MRI. And you could have this electrophysiological measure, this brain disruption, right? So these are the activities that you could measure. So this will help you to inform the brain regions that are involved in making these decisions to provide you some insight in their decision-making process. We could also measure these physiological measures like skin conductance, heart rate, pupil dilation. That, as we mentioned, the pupil dilation is a good measure of people's usage of system 1 of system 2. When people think hard using system 2, we will observe this pupil dilation. And we could also measure this neurochemical measurement like hormones, neurotransmitter dopamine, and serotonin. Right? So these are things that you could measure. So here is just some informational page. Right? So the things that you could measure to inform the decision-making process. In the exam, I will not test you on this. So here, these 2 slides, I will make it as some a side notes, just for completeness, for your understanding of the research in behavior economics, but they will not be tested in the exam. Right? So that's the general preview of the research methodology. And now, for the rest of today's lecture, we will focus on our discussion of experimental method. In other words, randomized evaluation. Right? So why do we need experimental method or randomized evaluation? So if you have been an economist for a long time, you will know that economists aim to recover causal relationship, right? Causal relationship is that instead of just caring about the correlation between some variables, economists, they care a lot about the causal relationship, whether A, the policy A would cause the outcome B, right? Because this causal relationship is very important to inform public policy. You need to know the exact causal effect of policy, not the correlation. So here are some examples to demonstrate why recovered causal relationship sometimes is difficult, because what we observe is correlation if we look at the natural occurring data. Right? So here, it has been observed that people who receive bonus at work tend to be more productive. Does this mean giving bonus to people would make people more productive? Can we conclude this causal relationship? Try to think. I mean, the answer is no. But can anyone come up with a counter argument? Even if people who receive bonuses at work tend to be more productive, that does not mean providing bonus would make people more productive. Yeah, Daniel?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think that it depends on the type of the incentives, because we're not sure what kind of other incentives would make people more productive, like an increase in salary or extra holiday, like vacation days.
Yeah.
And thus, it's not clear what is the main driving factor.
Yeah, that's true. So what Daniel is mentioning that there are different factors that would influence the effective use of bonus, right? That's true. What I want to get is another point. So here, in order to recover the causal relationship, we actually need to know for the people who receive the bonus and become more productive, what is the counterfactual? What would happen if they do not receive this corresponding bonus, right? So Eric has mentioned productive people tend to receive more bonuses. Yeah, I mean, that's the observation, right? So it is possible that the people who receive bonuses, they are different people from the group of people who don't receive bonuses. More productive people, they are receiving more bonuses. It's not the other way around. That's why it's difficult for us to recover this causal relationship, to establish this causal relationship, right? Again, the second one, now you get the idea. The main confound factor that prevent you from getting this causal relationship is this selection effect, right? So the group who receive the treatment, the so-called treatment, is different in nature compared to the group who have not received the treatment. Let's go through some more examples. People who meditate regularly tend to be happier. Does this mean regular meditation make people happier? It's possible. And actually, there are evidence showing that it is true. But just looking at people who meditate regularly tend to be happier cannot give you the causal relationship, because it may be the people who are happier, they they are more likely to try new things, to try meditation, right? So they think, right, they are happier, they are open to these new things that could make them even more happier. So these people who try the meditation, they may not be, they may be very different from the group people who have not tried. And it may be this the group people who meditate, they are happier from the beginning. And also dogs with male owners are shown to be more aggressive. I read this article from an Italian newspaper. But does this mean that male owners make their dogs more aggressive? No, because of the self-selection effect. It's the male owners. They're more likely to get big dogs. And these big dogs are more aggressive, right? So it's not a causal relationship. People with overweight friends tend to be overweight. Does this mean that if you hang out with friends who are overweight would make you become more overweight? I mean, there's evidence of that, but just looking at of this statement cannot give you the conclusion. But because it's very likely that people who are overweight, they are likely to befriend other overweight people because you feel more comfortable to be around people who are like you. The last one, shoppers who use credit cards tend to spend more than those who pay with cash. Does using credit cards cause people to spend more? It's possible, but just looking at this, you cannot get the conclusion, because it's possible that people who want to spend more, they are more likely to apply for a credit card, right? So these give us this idea that getting the causal relationship is not easy, because in order to recover the causal relationship, we need to know the counterfactuals. What do we mean by counterfactuals? It's quite an important concept. Counterfactuals represent the state of the world that participant would have experienced in the absence of treatment. So for example, if we look at all these examples, right, people who receive bonuses at work tend to be more productive. I mean, in order to show that bonuses make people more productive, we have to know what if the people who receive the bonuses would react if they do not receive. So that's the counterfactual. But the issue, the difficulty here is that you don't know, you never know for sure the counterfactual, because they have already received the bonus. You cannot just at the same time force them not receive the bonus. Right? So for here, shoppers who use credit cards tend to spend more. In order to establish the causal relationship, we have to know the shoppers who have used credit cards, how much they spend when they do not have the credit card, right? But that's the counterfactual we don't know. So the problem with this counterfactual is that we can never observe the counterfactual. And what we could do instead is to mimic or construct the counterfactual. And how do we do that? We could select a group of individuals that mimic the counterfactual. I mean, this group of individuals who mimic the counterfactual is called the control group or comparison group. So that leads us to the idea of randomized evaluation. So randomized evaluation is just the use of experiments for causal inference. Randomized evaluation would take a sample of interested population and randomly assign them to treatment group and control group. And because these two groups are randomly assigned, so statistically, you can show that statistically, these two groups are the same with each other. Right? And then after this random assignment, one group go through the treatment, the other did not go through the treatment. And because they are the same statistically, I mean, the only difference these two groups experience is the treatment, so that we could confidently claim that the effect or the measurement we observe after the treatment is purely caused by the treatment. So that is the idea of randomized evaluation or experimental method, right? So random assignment guaranteed two groups have statistically similar characteristics, right? So this can be verified by statistical analysis. So why do we randomize? Here is a visual illustration. Members of the group, the treatment and the control, they do not differ systematically at the outside of the evaluation. So before going through the treatment, because of the random assignment, you know that the two groups are the same statistically. And any difference that subsequently arises between them can be attributed to the program rather than to other factors. right? And that means this helps us to solve this counterfactual problem. Participants in the control group serve as a counterfactual of those in the treatment group in the absence of treatment. So here is a visual illustration, right? So you want to understand how the policy will influence the treatment group, the apples, and we need to come up with a control group that looks similar, or there's all kinds of characteristics. They are the same statistically. Then we force one group to go through the treatment, the other does not go to the treatment, and eventually the outcome would be only caused by the treatment that they go through. Okay, so that's the idea of randomized evaluation. So before we take the break, sorry, I talk too long, but we will have a shorter session after the break. So let's consider this interesting case study. Right? So here we know that the United States are going through this presidential election in November this year, right? So here is the case of presidential election back in the history, and it's quite interesting for us to understand why randomization is important to get reliable result. So in 1936 presidential election, Literary Digest is a magazine. They predict the Republican candidate would win by a landslide based on the poll they conducted. Instead, the results are quite different from the poll. I mean, this happened in 2016 when the poll, most of the polls predict that Hillary Clinton will win, but Donald Trump, as we know from history, actually won the presidential candidate, right? But here is similar. So here is the eventual result, right? So we see that the Democratic Party, Franklin Roosevelt, they win by a landslide, but it's in direct contract with the prediction of the poll. So what happened? Think about this, and we'll get back in about 10 minutes. Can we just get back a quarter past 11, and then we'll just answer early. Right? So think about this, and maybe a hint for you to consider is how the poll was conducted. So the Literary Digest, they actually get this so-called yellow book. From the yellow book, you are able to check the phone numbers of the household, right? So you can so they just call randomly. They actually have this randomization process. They randomly pick the sample and call them which candidate they will be in favor of, right? So they also go through this automobile registration, the car registration, and the car registration would also provide the phone number, and they also randomly select a sample there and call them and decide which party they are supporting. And that's how they get the result. Now think about this procedure and decide why they actually provide very different result from the reality. So anyone has thought about this issue, this very far off prediction by Literary Digest? So we have a Pam.
Yes, I actually talked about this with a friend of mine months ago.
Yeah.
And we came to the conclusion that the poll's failure was due to a biased sample, even though they randomized it. They only used the resources of a phone directory and vehicle registration, so that led to that biased sample, which were primarily wealthier households.
Mm.
And it was also during the Great Depression, so they only asked the wealthier households, they were for Elf London, obviously, for the Republicans, and the poorer households weren't questioned. And of course, they vote for the Democrats, Roosevelt in this scenario. So it's just that the representative sample wasn't chosen good enough.
Yeah, so that's very good observation, and that's actually what I want to mention. It's just a non-representative sample. Because of this non-representative sample, it gives misleading result. So exactly as Pam mentioned, so because they draw some sample from the phone book, the yellow book, right? So back then, just after this Great Depression, people who own landline phones, they are wealthy people compared to the average American. And also another sample they collect is from this automobile registration list. It basically, people who have cars will show up on this list. And because having cars is a good indicator of your wealth level, right? So they are basically just serving the wealthy people. And the wealthy people, they are supporters of Republican as it is today in the United States, right? So that's why it gives rise to this very misleading result. So here is an illustration of this importance of randomization. So when we talk about randomization, we could have two important processes. One is called random sampling, and the other is called random assignment, right? So here, you have a population you want to study. So if we look at this polling survey, the target population is the general population in the United States, right? And random sampling just select units from a population of interest in a randomized manner to create a sample that is representative of the population. And the important issue of the poll is that this random sampling is it is random sampling, but it's random sampling of the wealthy people. Right? The result, the poll result is just demonstrating the attitude of wealthy people. It's not the target population that you are actually interested in. That is the whole Americans, right? And because this sampling is not random, that would lead to this misleading result, right? So the first step of randomization is random sampling. You have a random sample of the target population that you are interested in, and to get this evaluation sample, right? And once you get the evaluation sample, if you're running an experiment, in the previous example, this poll is not an experiment. You don't need to random assign the people into different groups to evaluate the treatment effect. But if you're running an experiment to evaluate the treatment effect, then you go through the second step of randomization. That is random assignment. So random assignment is to allocate eligible units to treatment and control group by means of random process. Okay, both of these two randomization process are quite important because it influences the validity of the result we get from our experiment. So here, random sampling would influence the external validity of our result. External validity is just the acceptability of a result in contexts other than those in which the experiment was conducted, right? So external validity even applies to the poll, to the survey of the presidential candidates. Because it's not random sampling, the result you get from the poll cannot be generalized to the attitude of the whole population, right? So it limits this external validity of your study. On the other hand, the second step of randomization random assignment that influence the internal validity. Internal validity refers to the acceptability of the results of an evaluation in terms of causal impact of intervention. Right? The reason why the random assignment is important is because this random assignment would allow these two groups to be comparable to each other statistically. Right? If you are not randomly assigned to the treatment and control group, so that you have two groups, they are already different before going through the treatment, then you will not be able to get the effect of treatment because the difference may be caused by their inherently different characteristics of these two groups, right? So that's why random assignment is quite important to make sure the result you get from the experiment is valid. That is the so-called internal validity. Okay, so that's the two randomization process. Now, let me give you an example. How do we want to randomize in order to have this random assignment, talking about coughing that's coming, right? Even finally. So randomization can be achieved using software and the statistical package, right? For example, we want to randomly select half of the 26 eligible unit to go through the treatment. What you could do is for this 26 unit, you use this random number generator from the software or statistical package and to assign a random number, usually just a uniform distributed number from 0 to 1, right? So here we have 26 units from A to Z. And then you generate a random number for each of the unit. And then because you want to select half of the units to go through the treatment, what you could do is to order these 26 units by the value of the number, right? So here I just rank these numbers and order them in terms of the value, right? From the smallest one to the largest one, right? So now we have a new list. What we could do now is just select the first half of the ordered unit, right? So that is more or less the process I did to randomly assign you to different treatment in our online in-class experiment, right? But that's the general idea. So here is the indicator. So the one with the cross that represent the corresponding units are selected to go through the treatment. So what you could do alternatively, because it's a random number between 0 and 1, you could just set the threshold of 0.5. If the number is greater than 0.5, then it does not go through the treatment. It's a control group. If the number is below 0.5, then it goes through the treatment, right? So here you see the alternative method, you will have more units going through the treatment. So it should be 13, but you have 15. You have one number assigned from one group to the other, so that the treatment group is higher. So this unbalance could happen in reality, but if you have a large number of participants, right? If you have 26,000, and these two ways would almost give you exactly the same result. Because when you have a large number, then it's more likely for the two groups to be of the same size, right? So if you have two people, for example, you randomly assign them to two groups, it's very likely that two of them will be assigned to the same group if you use the threshold method. But if you have larger samples, then that's not an issue. As we'll talk about that, why having a large sample size is important to guarantee the validity of the result also. So once you have this randomization process, this random assignment, you could even use statistical method to check whether these two groups are statistically the same with each other. So if we have randomized properly, the characteristics between these two groups should be the same statistically, right? So what we could do is to have a balance check to show whether there is a statistical difference, statistically significant difference between the two groups on some important characteristics. For example, we have divided the groups into the treatment group and control group, right? And the different units will have different heights, and the heights are quite an important factor that we want to investigate. Here we can check whether the distribution of heights are more or less the same across these two groups, right? So here we have the height for the treatment group, the height for the control group. The average is 179 for treatment, 180 to the control. And if you run t-test, for example, these distributions are not statistically different from each other, meaning that in terms of height, they are the same statistically. So that's a balance check. However, one issue with the balance check is that when you have a large number of variables that you are interested in for these two groups, there is a likelihood that you will be able to observe some significant difference in at least one variable. Right? Well, because the statistical significance is measured by 95% confidence level, meaning that by chance, there will be 5% chance that one variable will be statistically different from each other. Meaning that if you have 20 variables, then on average, you will have, on average, one variable that is statistically different among these two groups. Right? So we will not go through this statistical details, but I just want to point out this phenomenon. You have a large number of observables of the variables. There's a chance that you have at least one of them to be unbalanced. Now, what to do if you have some variables to be unbalanced. Should we just re-randomize? Well, the answer is no. In general, we should try to avoid re-randomization, right? If you have some particular variable that you are interested in, that you want to be balanced across these two groups, what you could do is to have this as stratification or stratifying on this variable. For example, if you want to investigate how this treatment would have an effect on the participant depending on gender, then you would likely to want gender to be balanced across these two groups. So what you could do is to randomly assign males to treatment and control, and then randomly assign females to treatment and control, so that you know that the gender ratio is exactly the same across these two groups. So in that case, the important variable that you want to investigate, gender, is balanced. Right? So that's how you can do. If you have a large number of variables, some of them would be unbalanced. I mean, most of the situations is not important. It doesn't matter that much. But if you have some specific variable, you want to investigate whether that would interact with the treatment, or say whether the treatment would be dependent on that important variable, then you need to make sure that variable or those variables should be balanced. In that case, you could use this stratification method, stratifying on those methods in the sense that you first divide this population, the sample, into two groups depending on the value of those variables, and random assign each division of this group is split by this important variable into treatment and control. So that would make sure that important variable will be balanced across these two groups, right? So that's the idea. So now that's the discussion of this randomization effect, right? So we have two steps of randomization: random sampling, which guarantees external validity; random assignment, that would guarantee this internal validity of your result. Now, let's talk about some of the evaluation-driven effect that might influence, again, the validity of your result, which might cause your evaluation to be biased. So, in physics, there is the principle of non-observability, meaning that observing a certain object would actually change its behavior, right? So that is actually similar to human beings, and is especially so, right? So when people feel that they are being observed, their behavior are different. I mean, that's because people are social animals. When you believe that you are being evaluated, I mean, your performance, your behavior would be naturally different from when you are alone and you know that no one will observe you, right? So think about the coffee experiment. You have this different banner, right? So if you have a poster, a banner showing a pair of eyes, even though there are no actual eyes, if you feel that you are being observed, your behavior will be different, right? So similar idea. If you know that you're being evaluated, you may exhibit different behaviors, and that's not what the researcher, the experimenter, want. So this evaluation-driven effect is more common in field experiment due to less experimental control. Right? Participants may be aware of existence of different treatment, right? So in lab experiment, if you go through this experiment, even though you know that you are assigned to one treatment, you don't know what the experiment, you are not sure what other treatment other people are receiving. So because you don't know the other treatment, this existence of other treatment would not be able to influence you. But in field experiment, for example, you provide different incentives, right? For a student, if they reach a certain level, they will reach if the students reach certain grade in high school, they will be able to receive a reward, and different treatment would receive different amount of reward, and some control treatment would not be able to receive. If the participant going through different treatment, they are aware of the evaluation and they are aware of the existence of other treatment, I mean, that would inadvertently influence their behavior. And also another factor that would give rise to evaluation-driven effect is that the participant may interact with those from other treatment, right? And this social influence would cause the evaluation of the treatment to be biased. So that's how evaluation-driven effect may influence your result, and especially in field experiment. In lab experiment, you have more control. It still matters, but it's not that serious. So now let's just go through some of these well-documented behavior responses to evaluation. So first category is treatment group changes its behavior. You know that you are going through the treatment, then this knowledge would change your behavior, right? So the first one is called experimenter demand effect. The behavior change to the experimenter's objective. As we mentioned, when you participate in lab experiment or field experiment, you have some expectation of what the experimenter want, and the awareness of that expectation would change your behavior. And another interesting phenomena is called Hawthorne effect. Is the treatment group would work harder than normal when they know that they are being evaluated. Right? Another category of these behavior responses is the control group changes the behavior. The first one is called John Henry effect. It's just in comparison with the Hawthorne effect, is the control group works harder than normal. And also, when the control group know that they are going through the control, they are not receiving this treatment, for example, the reward, they may develop this resentment, and that would have this demoralization effect, right? So they think it's unfair that other group of people will be able to receive the reward. I'm not able to receive, then I give up. I don't want to work harder anymore. And also this anticipation effect is this behavior change in anticipation of treatment later. If some of the control group, they expect that the treatment will apply to them in the future. I mean, this is common in field experiment, not so common in lab experiment. That would also change their behavior. And the last category is the both group can be affected. It's this survey effect. Being surveyed changes subsequent behavior, right? So if you're surveyed, ask the question, how much water you use each week, right? So this question alone would be able to remind you that you should conserve water, and that change your behavior. So that's, again, a behavior response to evaluation. Now let's just go through two of this effect that is quite interesting. The Hawthorne effect and also this John Henry effect is this either the control or the treatment group, they work harder than normal. Hawthorne effect is named after this electric factory. It's called Hawthorne Works. So this experiment was from 1922 to 1932, 1924 to 1932. So the goal of the experiment is to investigate whether there are some changes in the environment, including this lightning, would change the workers' productivity. And the result is that when they increase the lightning, right, so it's more bright in the factory, they observe an increase in productivity. But so that makes them believe that lightning is important. However, in another treatment, when they reduce the lightning, make it more dim, more dark in the working environment, that also increase the workers' productivity. Why is this the case? Well, because the workers, when they know that they are being observed, that actually make them work harder. And this productivity gain is actually just a result of the attention paid to the worker. It's not the lightning. So this Hawthorne effect just refers to the fact that individual would modify their behavior when they think they are being observed, right? And another related effect is called John Henry effect. So this is named after John Henry and a famous story in history. So this is John Henry was a legendary American railway worker in the 1870s. So he heard that his output was compared to the output of machine, right? And he want to make sure that this human has its dignity and the human can outperform the machine, and he actually work harder to show that he is no less compared to a machine. And he actually won, and he actually produce more output compared to the machine. However, as a result of this overexertion of effort, he died, passed away after this experiment. So the Strong-Henry effect is just referring to an experimental bias resulted from reactive behavior by the control group. Okay, and now anticipation effect. So here is an interesting case. It's not from an experiment, but from a policy change, but it informs us about the point. So in 2019, the 1st of July, I keep reading the wrong number. 2014, the 1st of July, Australian government decided to give parents a baby bonus of 3,000 Australian dollars. And you know this low birth rate is a very prevalent issue across, especially the developed countries. So a lot of the developed countries come up with ideas to try to encourage people giving birth to increase the birth rate. And that's one policy Australian government decided to do. So now, thinking about this policy, what do you expect to happen? So if you look at the notes, you already see the following figure, right? If you look at this figure, the average birth rate before this policy was implemented, that is the 1st of July, and the average birth rate after the implementation, we did observe some slight increase, right? So this policy worked, but not dramatically. And also we observed some decreasing trend, right? Across the table. So here, what I want to pay attention to is now the effect of the policy, right? So in order to evaluate this effect, we need to look at the long-term trend. But what is interesting is the pattern right before and after the policy was implemented. So what is going on? Can someone explain? Trying to understand what happened there. Yeah, think. And then I'll try to have a discussion. Right? So we do observe a slight increase, but what is more interesting is the birth rate has dramatic drop right before the policy was implemented, and has a very dramatic increase right after the policy was implemented, right? So we could imagine. Pam, you want to
maybe it sounds funny, but maybe people gave birth before July 1st and but really got the birth certificate after the 1st of July to get the money.
Yeah, that's one possibility. That's quite interesting observation. Yeah. And another possibility, I mean, the main lesson that we could learn from this figure is that people respond to incentives, and also the policies change and the anticipation of the policy change would actually have a dramatic effect on people's behavior. I mean, one thing is the birth certificate, but in a developed country in Australia, I'm not sure whether it's easy to do that, right? So I need to check, but that's one possibility and a very likely possibility. Another possibility is that, you know, in medicine, there are ways to delay your delivery of the baby, right? So it's likely that some babies who are supposed to be born before the implementation, they actually have some way to postpone the delivery. And then that's why we see this dip and then an upshot, right? So that's the anticipation effect. So people respond to incentives and people respond to this anticipation of the change in policy. Okay, so these are some examples demonstrating this evaluation-driven effect, right? So this evaluation-driven effect would cost biased evaluation of our experiment. I mean, as researchers, we want to know how to limit this evaluation-driven effect so that our results are valid. So here are some things we could do. You could keep participants unaware of the study purpose or which group, whether they are in treatment or control, right? So keep that information hidden. So there is a so-called double-blind design. neither the participant nor the experimenters know which group is receiving treatment or control, or know the purpose of the experiment, right? So sometimes, like for example, I run an experiment. I have a certain expectation of the result of the experiment. So I might demonstrate it while explaining the experiments to the participant, right? So in order to eliminate this experimental demander effect, instead of me, who knows the purpose of the experiment, running the experiment, I asked someone else who are not aware of the real purpose of the experiment or the assignment of treatment to read the instructions and to help the students to go through the experiment. So that is the double-blind design that could limit this experimental demand effect. And then you could minimize the salience of evaluation as much as possible. For example, if you run a field experiment, instead of passing out the surveys, of course, sometimes you have to pass out surveys. If you are able to have some naturalistic observations or passive data collection, right? So by just going there and collect the data by counting them, for example, how healthy people are eating, how much water they are using by reading the meters instead of asking them. So this more passive data collection could minimize the salience of evaluation and minimize the evaluation-driven effect. And also another method is to measure the evaluation-driven effect in a subsample of in a subset of samples. So you could, make this evaluation more salient in some samples, and the other try to hide the evaluation, right? So by comparing these two groups, you are able to actually have a measure of the evaluation-driven effect. So sometimes it's actually quite interesting and important for us to understand the size of evaluation-driven effect, and the third method would help. Oh, I just noticed, someone remind me there was a raised hand that I didn't know. So if I did not notice the react to your raised hand, you can just unmute yourself and start talking, right? For the rest of the meeting. So another factor that I want to talk about that influenced the validity of our experiment is the sample size. So here is a quite interesting study. It shows that power posing. So power posing is just, you use some outward posing to show that you are powerful, like you stretch out to show your power. That's called the power posing. From this experiment, it's demonstrated to boost people's confidence and increase their tolerance of risk. And there is actually an even very famous TED presentation talking about this research. Right? It's a very famous research, and it's very interesting phenomena. However, the other researchers, when they try to replicate the study, they find it's very difficult to find any effect of power posing. Okay, what is the issue? If we look at the original study, so they only has the sample of 42 participants, and that's a very small sample size in order to give you a valid result. So one important thing that we should consider when we run experiment is to choose a sample size large enough so that you are able to get valid, reliable result. Right? So again, this is not a class in statistics. We will not go into the theoretical details, but I will just give you some rule of thumb to determine the sample size. So the reason we want to pay attention to sample size is partially because of the recent so-called replication crisis. Replication, what do we mean by replication? Replication is just one of the central issues in any empirical study. We mentioned that one advantage of experiment in economics is the ease of replicating previous studies, right? You prepare the data, the corresponding instructions, the procedures so that other people could replicate it, right? So that's the so-called replication. But in the past several decades, we have especially social science, especially psychology and also medicines, they observe this replication crisis, meaning that results of many scientific studies, especially in psychology, they are difficult or impossible to reproduce or to replicate. And if you look at the reason, the main reason for this spurious result and difficulty is low power. Okay, so that's why we should pay attention to the power in order to have reliable result. So the problem with low power study, low power means that your test only has a small chance of detecting a true effect. If there is an effect, and if the size is not enough, and there's a high chance for you to detect that effect. But that's not a big issue in compared to the second issue. Your results are likely to be distorted by random and systematic errors, meaning that even the second type of error is that even though there is no effect, the low power study will be able to give a significant result. Right? So this is definitely not something we want. And this causes the main reason for replication crisis. So this low power study will give you some significant result, but this result may be misleading because you might just capturing this effect by chance. Well, there's no true effect. So instead of going through these technical details, what I want to give you some insight is just a rule of thumb based on the standardized effect size. So the standardized effect size can be measured by Cohen's d. So this is a standardized effect size that is defined as the difference between two means divided by the standard deviation for the data, right? So if you have the treatment group and the control group, you have the distribution of the data. So you normalize it to standardized normal distribution, and you have some expectation about the effect. So that standardized difference is called Cohen's d. So here is some illustration, right? So d equals 0.5 means there's the effect size is 0.5 standard deviation of the data. So here we have the mean of the treatment group, the mean of the control group. D equals 0.5, meaning that this difference between this mean is just 0.5 standard deviation. Right? So that is a small effect size. So a rule of thumb that I want to give you is that we just assume a small some effect size. And usually we want to make sure the power of the study is at least 80%, 0.8. And the significant level as a rule of thumb, as a convention, is 0.005, is 5%. And if you think your effect size is moderate, 0.5, then you need at least 51 observations in each group in order to detect the true effect. And if you think the effect size is only 0.3 standard deviation between these two treatments, then you need a much higher observation. You need 145 observations in each group, right? So as a rule of thumb, in order for you to have a good powered study, you have a treatment group and control group. You need at least 51 observations in each group, right? So in comparison, the original study of this power posing, there are only 42 participants in total. That means 20-something in each group. And it's very easy to lead to this misleading result because it's underpowered.